I'm Park Howell, and welcome to the Business of Story, where I consult, teach, coach, and speak on the applied science and bewitchery of brand and business storytelling, so that you can clarify your story to amplify your impact and simplify your life.
I thought it was just a stupid picture of a pig in the ocean. But after hearing that story, I had to have it. Now I wasn't just buying a picture. I was buying a story. Story literally made the picture worth more money to me.
That's what businesses are about. People buy brands. People buy stories much more than anything else.
I work with a lot of big enterprise companies, but let's just say I always tell folks, drop the PowerPoint, close your laptops, start with your story.
If you want people to get engaged and you want people to act, you have to tell them an emotionally powerful story. That's with great characters, it's with uncertain outcomes, and it's with high stakes and drama.
All business strategy is a story.
The other night, Michelle and I were watching Comedians in Cars Getting Coffee with Jerry Seinfeld. I think it's one of the best 20 minutes of entertainment you can get on any screen these days. And what always surprises me is how fairly unfunny most of the comedians are when they're not on stage, but in a car with Jerry getting coffee. But what I like most is that you get to see the other side of the person, the one that speaks a different lingo than their entertainer side. They become a little more like us. And that works for me. So anyways, in this particular episode, we were watching Steve Martin, one of my all-time favorite comics. I love not only his stand-up, but I loved his movies too. You know, he's a pretty dang funny guy no matter where you catch him. There's just something about his demeanor and delivery that speaks to me, speaks my lingo. And one of my favorite, although fairly obscure bits of his is this one, when he is attempting to connect with plumbers at a plumber's convention with the plumber's joke.
Hey, I don't like to gear my material to the audience, but I'd like to make an exception because I was told that there is a convention of plumbers in San Francisco this week, and I understand about 30 of them came down to the show tonight. So before I came out, I worked up a joke especially for the plumbers, and now those of you who aren't plumbers probably won't get this and won't think it's funny, but I think those of you who are plumbers will really enjoy this. And so if you're not a plumber, please just bear with me for a while and just kind of hold off on this, but I would like to do this for the plumbers. So here we go. This lawn supervisor was out on a sprinkler maintenance job, and he started working on a Finlay sprinkler head with a Langstrom 7-inch gangly wrench. Well, just then a little apprentice leaned over and said, you can't work on a Finlay sprinkler head with a Langstrom 7-inch wrench. Well, this infuriated the supervisor, so he went and got volume 14 of the Kinsley manual. And he reads to him and says, the Langstrom 7-inch wrench can be used with the Finlay sprocket. Just then, the little apprentice leaned over and says, it says sprocket, not socket. Were those plumbers supposed to be here this show, or was that...
Do you ever feel like you're selling sockets, but your audience is hearing sprockets? Well, if you're not speaking the secret language of your customer, then you're probably leaving sales, margins, and loyalty out to dry. Today's guest lives and breathes the mantra, people hire you because you get them and they get you. He's a client whisperer of sorts. His name is Jeffrey Shaw, and he's the author of the new book, LINGO, Discover Your Customer's Secret Language and Make Your Business Irresistible. Having a keen eye isn't just for what one sees, but also for what one senses. Having been one of the most sought-after portrait photographers in the U.S. for more than 3 decades, Jeffrey Shaw, a.k.a. the Lingo Guy, uses his honed intuition to teach entrepreneurs how to attract their ideal customers by speaking their secret language. Jeffrey is host of the popular business podcast Creative Warriors, a nationally acclaimed keynote speaker, and a business coach for entrepreneurs. In fact, I'm working with Jeffrey right now to help hone my lingo in the stories I tell here at the Business of Story so I can attract my ideal customer. And that's what this show is about today, to help you do the exact same thing. You're going to learn the 5 steps of the secret language strategy that allows you to pose profound questions inside your customer's head. You're going to hear how Jeffrey grew his portrait photography business by 500% in 1 year using his own lingo technique. And you'll finally understand why when you're experiencing synchronicity in your business, it simply means you're on the right path, following your unique purpose in life. So get out your 7-inch Langston Gangly Wretch, and let's start plumbing the lingo in your stories with Jeffrey Shaw. Jeffrey, welcome to the Business of Story.
Hey there, Park. Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Oh, absolutely. Fascinated by your book, Lingo. This is something out of over 150 episodes now here that we've not covered this particular topic. And what that is, at least in my mind, and you might correct me, is understanding that voice, the lingo of your ideal customer, which to me is knowing who they are, what they're about, what journey they're on, so that you, as the provider, as their provider of a service or a product, can connect with them on their terms. That's hugely important. How did you come around to this concept of lingo in the first place?
Well, and you're absolutely right. And I appreciate you getting that and also explaining it as you did. I really appreciate that because, by definition, lingo is a jargon, right? I mean, and that's the logical way of looking at it. But what I'm speaking to when I'm talking about lingo is just as you described it. To know someone's lingo is to know their values, their priorities, and most importantly, perhaps, is to know their emotional triggers, right? What is it that inspires them to step up and hire you over everybody else, right? And that is our greatest challenges in today's busy, noisy marketing world is how do we rise above? How do we connect? And I'm raising the stakes on even that alone, right? I'm raising the stakes by saying the goal should not be to just stand out and rise above the noise. The goal should be to stand out, rise above the noise specifically to your ideal customer, because working with your ideal customer is the most efficient and fastest way to a profitable business. So you're not wasting your time on people that don't pay you what you're worth or debate what you're worth, and or you don't want to waste your time trying to convince people to see value in who you are and what you do, as opposed to being found by the people who already value what you do. And when you speak someone's lingo, you're creating a bond connection such like, okay, I get you and you get me, and that's the bond. And the story as I laid out in my book, Lingo, the story I provide, there are many stories in the book. I think the grounding one as to how I came about this, which is your question, is of course by first understanding when it's wrong, which unfortunately is a lot of times the way we figure things out. And I went back to my hometown, a couple hours north of New York City, 20 years old, to start a photography business, which I had very grandiose ideas, right? I to this day, and I do far less photography, I still do a little, but I place a really high value on what it means to have photographs to hand down. And what the challenge was, I realized I returned to an area to start my business in a community, which I grew up in, which is lower middle class socioeconomically. And, here I am trying to promote this idea of think long term. Like it's worth the price because you're going to hand it down.
You're shooting portraits?
Yeah, family portraits of families, kids.
And were you a photographer as a kid growing up? I mean, did you just always like this? So you thought you would fire up a photography business at the age of 20?
So my father enjoyed photography as a hobby. So we had a darkroom in the house. And I actually was more intrigued initially by the chemicals and the production of like the darkroom back in the day. I was actually more intrigued by that first. So I would print my father's photographs. I started printing, photographs for other people. Then eventually I almost looked like a singer-songwriter, right? I sort of wanted to experience what it'd be like to print my own imagery as opposed to just printing for others. So then I started shooting in order to have things to print. The challenge part was that I joke that, I had paralyzing shyness. I was just going to joke and say that I didn't like people much, but in a way that's true, right? When you're really shy.
Just reframing that to paralyzing shyness. Okay.
Exactly. But I kind of didn't like people. I was intimidated. And so I photographed inanimate objects. I did a lot of fine art, and architecture was I just loved architecture. And I actually went off to photography school. My ambition was to be an architectural photographer.
Where'd you study?
So it was a school called the Hallmark Institute of Photography, which unfortunately no longer exists. Just closed a couple years ago, as have most photography schools. It's an industry that's been hit hard by the transition into digital and people not knowing how to market it. Again, photographers, in a lot of ways, it's a good example of not understanding the lingo because it seems like it's a tangible product, but I never sold the photographs. I sold, and I mind you, what my work resulted in were large photographs that would hang on the walls and over fireplaces and such. So there's a tangible result to what I did, but it's never what got me the clients. What got me the clients was the fact that I understood their lingo. So I kind of hooked them in emotionally to feeling like this is the only photographer I can work with. He's the only photographer that gets me and gets my lifestyle, which was for the very affluent people. And this is, to kind of unwind back to my original story, or is that my origination story, you could say, is that I eventually realized that I was not speaking the right lingo of the town in which I was trying to build my business in my hometown, because I'm speaking the lingo of people that appreciated long-term thinking to a community of people who didn't know if they could afford their rent that month.
You're trying to sell high-end photography portraits to people that just didn't have the money to buy it.
Right. And and whether they had the money or not, because here's the thing, Park. Yes, there is, I'm not going to be unrealistic. There's a point where people just can't afford something. But here's the thing. We all know that for the most part, we will somehow justify it, right? We will always come up with a way. We are emotional buyers. So we first attach emotionally to something we want, and then we will justify it. So it's not that nobody in the area could afford financially. It's not that nobody could afford what I did. There just wasn't, the value and the appreciation wasn't there. It wasn't a priority. It's not one of their life values. The other side of that is the more affluent clientele who I ended up working with, their whole world, their priorities, their whole world is geared towards thinking for the future. Because when you have money, money's not an excuse. They are thinking about their children's Ivy League educations before they've even had children. They're planning ahead. Photography, therefore, means a tremendous amount to them, because they're not just thinking about the photographs they need for today. They're thinking about the photographs. They're thinking about the appreciation they will gain from their children when their children have these photographs to look back at when they're 40 and 50 years old.
And when was the moment? Take us there that you knew you had to make a change in your struggling photography business.
I had a woman visiting me, and I made my best, pitch as a photographer, explaining to her how it's important to have preserved children's memories. And remind me, by the way, there's a story that I'll share with you that kind of comes up later, but ties this in beautifully. But I told her, I was explaining to her the value of having family portraits. And she looked at me and she said, "That sounds great and all, but I don't know how I'm making my rent this month. I don't have the luxury to worry about my children's memories." That hit me like a ton of bricks. I literally sat back in my chair, and it answered everything that had confused me for 3 years before, which was, it wasn't that I wasn't good at what I did. It wasn't that they were bad people. And the problem was that I wasn't speaking the right lingo. No matter what I said to this woman, I wasn't really ever going to convince her that it was worth financially stretching in order to have photographs to hand down, because it just wasn't important enough to her. And again, it's not that the money wasn't there. It just, as a community, it wasn't. Spark, there's a lot of connections, right? I grew up in this community I grew up in. Like I went to photography school. I didn't go to university. I didn't go to college. Honestly, it wasn't much a source of conversation where I grew up. It was in the country, and it was, as I said, lower socioeconomic. So compared to, where I raised my kids in a town in Connecticut, all but one child went to higher education, right? All but one. So it was expected. It was part of the lingo of their upbringing. Like, this is what you do. You go to high school, you succeed, and you go on to college. Where I grew up, there was no follow-up conversation. My parents never brought it up in conversation as to what you do after high school. It was never part of our conversation. Same thing, my father passed away at 52 years old without life insurance. I've had life insurance since I was 19, right? Because I'm always thinking ahead.
But that was the lingo of where you grew up. This is just what these folks knew. It wasn't right or wrong. It's just what worked for them. And you had this photography business for 3 years. It took you 3 years. And I think it takes all of us a long time for some of the most obvious things to hit us upside the head where we actually get it then. Why do you think, or what was it about that moment that created such an aha for you that you could look back at your 3 years and go, oh, that's why I'm not growing the business the way I want to?
As someone asked me recently, how do you know when you're working with the wrong clients? One of the things I said is that you just don't feel like you're on the same page, right? And that was, so I can remember physically feeling, we're talking 30 years ago, I can remember physically feeling like in that moment, it's like I could talk to her for the rest of the day and this isn't going to go anywhere. We're just not on the same page. And the other thing that became really important is that she used the word luxury. And I had never, that gave me a name for the lingo. I needed to speak the lingo of luxury. I had never identified what I was doing as a portrait photographer as a luxury product, but it is. You don't have to have photographs. So what I did was I realized
you're obviously running around the wrong market to sell luxury photography.
Yeah, it wasn't a luxury-minded community. When you're worried about your essentials, you're not thinking luxury. So I had to put pieces together. And what became clear to me is that I needed to reach a luxury market. And the luxury market is the more affluent, upscale market. So I took it upon myself for 3 months to study the behavior of customers that went to high-end brands. And I always want to be clear on this. Like, I went to the high-end brands. I went to exclusive department stores that, the story I tell in LINGO is a trip to Bergdorf Goodman, which is one of the most exclusive. It's a one-of-a-kind department store in Manhattan, one of the most exclusive in the world. So I went there, and I went to, Ralph Lauren was really a newer brand in the 80s and had a flagship store in New York City. And I went to Le Cirque restaurant. I went to high-end restaurants, high-end retail. Now, mind you, I went there, and this very same thing can be done today online, where you can go to websites that super affluent go to that you may not be familiar with, but can find out about. My goal was not to understand, I wasn't studying the brand as much as I was trying to understand the emotional triggers that caused this clientele, that inspired this clientele to choose that brand. What did they experience when they went to these stores that made them feel they were at home, that this was where they belonged? So a quote I'll offer to kind of bring this home is, which I use often, and this has been a transition I've seen in the last 30 years, is nowadays, people don't hire you because you're the best. They hire you because you get them and they get you. So what I wanted to understand is what these high-end brands and the people that went there, what kind of relationship they had. Because my feeling was, if I could understand the emotional triggers of a clientele that I didn't come from money, I didn't know it at the time. I didn't know what made them tick. If I could understand what made them tick and what emotionally triggered them, I could then build a business that spoke the same language that they were already accustomed to, that they would recognize as, oh, this is the photographer for me. So I studied these high-end brands so that I could parallel myself, if you will, to a similar experience when they came upon what I did.
Yeah. And Jeffrey, was this kind of just like a flood of awakening for you, starting from that lady back there in your hometown, and you're going, oh, she is describing this as luxury. I need to have a better understanding of this luxury audience. And so you thought, well, how do I do that? I mean, you kind of bootstrapped it. You ran then into Manhattan, and you say in your book too, I think you had all of $20 on you when you went into the department store and you bought a little votive candle, and you asked the lady there that was wrapping the candle, how do you make it look luxurious? What do your audiences expect? So when I was reading that, I was kind of getting this impression that you were like this commando, like, oh, I'm onto something here. I'm just not quite sure where I'm going to find all my answers. So you just sort of embedded yourself in the luxury world, even though maybe at the time you couldn't quite afford it yourself.
Correct. And I think you said it beautifully, that it was sort of a flood of awarenesses. And I almost look at it as radio stations, right? We all know we have our own genre of music we like, and we know that there are other radios on other frequencies. We know they're there, but we just don't choose to get on that frequency. There's a way in which we kind of know, we know there's rich people, we know there's poor people, we know there's everything in between. But do we know what's going on that frequency? Like, do we listen to that frequency? And to me, of course, growing up in lower middle class, and, I saw on TV people with fancy homes. And, I think I reference in the book that my entire image of what it meant to be affluent were Bing Crosby's Christmas specials. I mean, that was my entire vision of what it must be to have money, because you wear nice sweaters, you sit around and sing songs with your family around a fireplace, right? It just looked so idyllic. I'm like, that must be, because my family didn't do that, right? I mean,
the picture of affluency.
Yeah, that was my only vision. And, and it was California. And, I kind of held that up as the vision of what wealth must look like. But I otherwise had no real experiences. So the point is that we know it's there, right? We know there are options. It's whether when you get into that frequency, it does feel exactly as you said. I just felt like it was a flood of awarenesses as I started studying these brands and seeing the pricing psychology and how one of my big awarenesses when I went to Bergdorf Goodman, I started looking around at, the separate rooms, and they were all designer names. Like what clearly inspired people to pay a premium price was when the products offered, the clothing, what have you, the home goods were in people's names. And my business at the time wasn't. I had a, clever little photography name. It was called Light Images Photography Studio. That was a huge awakening. It's like, oh, people will pay a premium and feel like they're hiring that individual.
Yeah, I got to ask you that, Jeffrey. How was that realization made? I mean, that almost sounds like a gut instinct or a guess that you took, but it works? Or was it just like such an aha moment to you that people actually want to buy the people's name attached to a home good?
Yeah, for me, it was an aha moment. And, and again, Ralph Lauren was just coming big into the scene in the early 80s. Now, this is a big company, right? But yet it's one person's name. Here's how important that moment was when I realized that in that moment, I needed to shift my business. I always joke, I was blessed with a good name for an affluent clientele, Jeffrey Shaw, right? It's just a nice, clean name. My mother's maiden name is Duarte. I'm proud to be a 50% Portuguese, but Jeffrey Duarte is not as marketable a name.
Right.
Right? Jeffrey Shaw is just a good, clean, marketable name. And I'll tell you a funny story about that. So if anyone looks at my logo, you'll see that after my name, except on the cover of my book, but there's a reason for that too. But typically, my business card or such, at the end of my name, there is a small diamond-shaped, what I refer to as a period. All right. So where one would put a period, I have a little diamond shape. And actually, that diamond does carry out throughout my book, Lingo, just not after my name, because people found it confusing on the cover. But it's on the binding, it's on the pages, it's the division between chapters. There's that diamond. Well, the story behind that diamond is that when I made the decision that in order to create a really deeply personal relationship with my clients and command a more premium price, that I needed to shift my name to be my business to be in my name. I was working with a graphic designer who I always say he was elderly. He was probably younger than I am now, but he seemed elderly when I was so young. He kept insisting that, because he was following the old typical business model. He's like, well, if the business is going to be your name, it should be Jeffrey Shaw Photographers. It should be Jeffrey Shaw Photography Studio. It should be Jeffrey Shaw and Associates. Like, he insisted that to leave room for growth, I shouldn't just name the business myself, that it should seem bigger. And I kept saying, no, what I'm building is a brand that's going to be based on me, and I'm going to be emotionally triggering people to feel like they're getting me and they're getting my photography skills. And so I said to him one day, I said, it's Jeffrey Shaw, period, as one does to assert themselves.
Not just a period, but a diamond.
Yeah, well, he came back with a logo mock-up, which was just a period. But again, as I speak the lingo of my clientele, I loved it. I was like, that would be the statement I will remember forever. The moment that I owned and made a statement, it's like, no, it's Jeffrey Shaw, period. But now I said to him, but now I want you to change that into a diamond shape, because the diamond looks wealthy.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's just part of the lingo, right? It's just just changing the shape, but it's the statement is always there, but it's just changing that to a diamond to just say the Jeffrey Shaw brand is about quality. And in the case as a photographer, it was about serving an affluent clientele.
And so did you do all of this while you were still trying to figure it all out? I mean, here you were trying to level up into this luxury market, probably like most entrepreneurs still didn't have a lot of money to go on, but you had your gut that said, I need to start speaking their lingo. How long did it take for you to start landing, the kinds of clients you were looking for, and what has it meant to your business over the years?
So it was about for about 3 months, I felt like I was living dual lives because I was still trying to manage. The good news is that, when you're changing your business, chances are you're not doing a lot of business, right? So the good news is I had some time at hand, but I was living dual lives because I was existing at getting whatever business I could in my hometown and rebuilding my brand. And I also personally moved from New York to Connecticut. So I moved about 2 hours away and actually did that for my then wife's job. She was supporting us. So because I wasn't making any money. So I moved 2 hours away to Connecticut, and Connecticut's known to be a wealthy state. And I was about an hour north of what was known to be the Gold Coast of Connecticut, where the really pockets of money was. I was living about an hour north of that, where I could afford to live. I was in between, had these two businesses in a way, 2 hours apart. So I spent 3 months really studying those brands, changing my logo, redesigning my services, redesigning my prices such that, this is kind of the inside scoop, and I do share it in the book. It was a little scary of me to share this because I want to make sure people know that I do work in integrity, but this is what happens when you're transitioning your business. That for about a couple months, those 3 months, I was rebranding myself in Connecticut and knew that I had to charge a premium price in order for it to even be perceived as quality. So an 8x10 in my hometown was just under $50. This basically the same 8x10 in my new territory was $300. Now, yes, there was some modification to the quality of the mounting material. The presentation of it was greatly improved, but the fact of the matter is none of which added up to a boatload of money. I knew that I had to charge a premium price in order to be, for it to be perceived as quality.
Yeah, so you went from the $50 8x10 brand up to $300. What percentage increase is that?
Yeah, it's 6 times. I mean, it's 600 times.
And like you said, it may be a 10% more increase in your cost to make that happen?
Yeah, it wasn't much of an increase in cost, but it was positioning, which is what I teach in Lingo, is like pricing is all about perception and it's about positioning. And we all think about it, Park, how many, most of us have had the experience where we've chosen to not buy something because the fact it's inexpensive, we assume it must not be good enough, right? So I had to speak that lingo and charge that premium price in order to make sure I positioned myself amongst the high quality. And you had asked about results. So I'll just get to the point of the results here. So in 1 year, I multiplied my business 5 times, and it was pretty instant. So, for example, here's a good I think a good lingo story. When I was doing some research on this new area, this new territory that I wanted to present my photography in, I literally knocked on, when I say knocked on doors, I knocked on other business. Like I just kept introducing myself. Here's like crazy marketing stunt I did. Back in the day, it was, especially in the 80s, photographs were often mounted on canvas. So it gave it a painterly feel, which I was never a huge fan of, because I think photographs should look like photographs, paintings should look like paintings. But people liked it. And one thing it enabled me to do is I could mount big, beautiful portraits on canvas, and I could roll those canvases up in a tube, and I would stick them in a black architectural tube, meaning a tube that an architect in the old days would carry blueprints. I suppose I still carry blueprints. So you'd put these blueprints in a tube. Well, I had rolled up canvases in this black tube. And now, mind you, I'm like 23 years old at this point, and I'm walking around stores in affluent towns with this black tube over my shoulder. For one reason, people would ask me, what is that?
Right.
And I'd say, oh, well, I'm a photographer. And as I'm saying, I'm unscrewing the top of the tube and pulling it out. That's how I got my work out there. Here's a fun story. So one of these stores that I went into was a children's clothing store. Because what I knew was, a children's clothing store in an affluent town, that's where my ideal customer would be going. Right? They're going to expensive child boutiques. And this one was called Beecham Place. And it was owned by a woman whose name was Susie Hilfiger. Knew nothing of that name at the time. That's exactly how I was in there. First of all, a 23-year-old kid, it probably seems odd that I'm in a children's clothing store, but I could be buying a gift. I'm looking around. She asks what's in the tube. I pull up my photographs. She's blown away by the photographs and how unusual they were. And they were beautiful. And she casually said to me at one point, as I was leaving, by the way, she said to me, over in the corner, there were some sweaters. Men's sweaters. I thought that was kind of odd. It was such a departure from the merchandise. She said, yeah, well, my husband sells clothes out of, his car. She goes, so I gave him a corner of the store to show his sweaters. Go take one, she said. So I
Hilfiger, huh?
Yeah. So this is Tommy Hilfiger when his wife was making the money, right? Literally, she had the child boutique and nobody knew who he was yet. And so I got my first free Tommy Hilfiger sweater before anybody knew the name. And but she introduced me to some really key people. And as I was going about this town, somebody mentioned to me that I should consider donating to silent auctions. Now, Park, I don't know about you, but this is the 80s. I'm 23 years old and I grew up in a lower middle class town. I didn't even know what the hell a silent auction was. Never heard the term. So I had to ask, I was like, what is that? Well, what I found out amongst the lingo of wealthy people is that they throw these big fundraisers for a good cause. And one was coming up, which was in support of the local art museum. And they were throwing the Renaissance Ball with a theme of Phantom of the Opera because it was like 1985 or something. As a silent auction donor, you donate your services and then the attendees bid silently on a clipboard usually, or nowadays electronically. They bid on and then the highest bidder wins what you've donated. Right. So I donated to this event, Phantom of the Opera theme. And the goal was, my thought was, well, I'm donating my services, but I would get a good client. Right. And if I could get one good client, one ideal customer at a time, I could then get referrals. And, that's how I would build my business. I didn't think, and again, I guess I was partly thinking, wow, I was going to have massive exposure at this event because I'd have a photograph on display and people would see it. It never really worked out to be that way. After 30 years of people are drinking. They don't remember what they've seen. But the benefit of donating to a silent auction on one hand is you get an ideal client as long as you've donated to the right organization. But here is the real key, Park. Every person, in most cases, they were the women that were running these events. Every woman that I interacted with that was running the event became a client. I was, getting to know them. It was the relationship that was built by talking to them about my donation, then dropping off my display and then picking up the display. I think about 12 of the families, 12 of the women who were part of running this event, I think they hired me. So when I say my success took off instantly, it was pretty instant.
I read this book a couple months ago, and I've talked about it now several times in the show, called Hit Makers. What makes, something go viral, or how do you, pick up on it? Starts with familiarity, and I know you talk a little bit about that, and we'll next get into your 5 steps of understanding people's lingo. But one of the other big things that the writer Derek Thompson talks about is this absolute crucial element of connectivity. Somebody or someone's that can help you grow. And you just demonstrated that by happening to be your own experiential marketing team, walking around town with your black tube, with your photos in it. And you just happened to run into Susie Hilfiger, who you said was then key to get you involved in other things. And you go to the silent auction, and it's not the person that buys it, but it's the people you interact with to continue to grow your connectivity. And because you knew their lingo, or were still learning it, but were wise enough to speak that lingo to them, then they brought you in to be a part of their own and became a vendor, a supplier to them, and your business went from there, it sounds like.
Correct. And it might not surprise you to know, Park, that I now walk around with a bright red, like a messenger bag that says, because the cover of Lingo is red, so I walk around with a bright red messenger bag that has the word lingo really big across it.
Oh, it totally makes sense.
Might not surprise you as to why, right? Because people, what is that?
Well, we just literally launched a new product. It's an all-natural supplement for allergy season, and it's got these 5 wonderful ingredients in it. It's called Heirloom. You can check it out, AIRLOOM, and you can check it out at heirloomsupplement.com. But what your story reminded me of is I got our samples in 2 weeks ago, and I walked over to the UPS store to send some off to a friend in Seattle so that he could share it. And I had that big bottle of Heirloom in my hand while I was sending the rest of them. And the guy behind the counter goes, "Oh, what's that?" So the exact same reaction you had. And then I went over for my power lunch at Subway Sandwiches to order my tuna fish sandwich. I had another bottle in my hand, know the guys behind the counter, and they're making my sandwich. And sure enough, I get to the register, and they're like, "Oh, what's that?" It's so interesting how our curiosity of human beings will pick something unusual and unique out. And it's in a familiar setting, a person walking around, whatever, but it's unique enough that it begs the question, what's that? Which then opens the door to sell your product or service.
And I think a lot of people are waiting for an opportunity to have a connective type of conversation, right? I mean, you're talking about people sitting behind a Subway counter making sandwiches all day, a woman in a clothing store, Susie Hilfiger waiting in a clothing, maybe not a lot of customers coming in that day. They're craving a quality connective conversation such that if you present in front of them something unusual, you're inspiring that moment of connectivity and relationship building.
You absolutely are. And I think people might even listen to this and say, "Oh, Jeffrey just got lucky. He just happened into Susie Hilfiger, and who knew what was going to happen there?" And my argument to that would be, lucky, or is it kind of design serendipity? Because you designed this idea of walking around with the product, and you were out there doing it. You were pushing the universe, saying, "This is what I want to do, and I'm doing my part to figure out, how to sell into this luxury market." And then the universe happens to put the Susie Hilfigers in our paths as we do that.
Right. Which, again, she wasn't of any particular acclaim at the time, or her husband hadn't hit it. I mean, she was a store owner.
Exactly. Which makes it seem even more lucky, but it's cool.
It unfolded that way. But again, I mean, I was walking around those tubes with that tube everywhere and meeting all sorts of people and putting myself in, in the simplest way, Park. I've got 3 kids who are adults now, and they grew up in a very nice community in Connecticut, and we had a nice home and all that. So I knew my kids were blessed, and they knew it too. But I wanted to have kids that, like me, would be willing to work hard. So I raised them with a very particular principle, which they heard all the time and could recite to you in a second, which is you have to meet the sun halfway. Right. I wanted them to have an attitude. I wanted them to see the blessings and the gratitude of life. So I wanted them to feel that metaphorically the sun was shining on them, but I didn't want them to be entitled. So I embedded in them these values that you have to meet the sun halfway. And I feel that way about success. We want success, but you have to meet the sun halfway. The Field of Dreams is a great movie, but a terrible business advice. Like, you don't build it and they will come, right? You build it for the people. This is the whole concept of Lingo is first starting by defining who your ideal, and I didn't know you want to go through the 5 steps. Well, there's a step prior to the 5 steps, which is first you have to define whom your ideal customer is, right? Whom is that? Who, the path to that answer is not so much about them as it is about you. What are your innate characteristics? What's the skill set and talent that you bring to the table? What is it about your unique perspective? How is it that you look at what you do differently than anybody else doing that same thing or something similar? And then you ask what I say is that the most important question you can ask about defining who your ideal customer is. First, you look at yourself and you understand what you're bringing to the table. And then you ask, and who will love that? Right? That's how you define. You look for the audiences that are going to love who you are and what you have to offer, love your brand voice, love your style, everything you're bringing to the table. Figure out and define who your ideal customer is by understanding yourself, and then say, well, then who would love that?
And how do you figure that out?
It's just what would help them. Who, in what area of life are there people that need a solution to whatever you have to offer as a solution for them? Mm-hmm. I said, and when that woman said luxury for me, that made me realize that's who I'm for. Even though I grew up lower middle class, as a photographer, I was for wealthy people. And that became blatantly clear to me because I didn't think like my family. I didn't think like my own family. So my father died at 52 of no life insurance. I had life insurance at 19, right? Because I'm thinking you plan for the future. So part of this practice, by the way, is when I work with my coaching clients to help them discover, how we're going to define their ideal customers. One of the things we do is we do an exercise. I call it the list of compliments. And I ask my clients to make a list of the compliments they've heard throughout their lives. Because that tells us a lot, right? First of all, I tell them, pay particular attention to those compliments that you want to brush off. It's like no big deal. Because honestly, those traits that other people see in you, that they're identifying and they're pointing out and complimenting you on that, it's you want to brush it off because it's so innate to who you are. You almost don't see the value in it.
That's interesting.
Which is why people have It's why people have such a hard time charging for what comes easy to them. We have no problem charging the big bucks for what's hard to do, hard labor, intensive, but we have a hard time charging for our most natural gifts, which is what comes easy to us.
What were yours when you thought about that in the past? What would people compliment you that you would brush off?
The thing, and I recently kind of came to realize that complimenting and teasing can go pretty hand in hand.
That's interesting.
So something that people point out to me all the time was I'm a complete neat freak. I really am. Like, it's not easy to live with me personally. But I am, because everything's in order. I know where everything is. I'm extremely neat. I'm really detail oriented. And again, if I ask the question, and who would love that? Affluent people. You know why? Because for someone of money to hire a photographer, they don't want to have to worry. My clients do not have to worry about their hair being anything but perfect. They don't have to worry about their clothes. I'm not going to capture their family portrait in an image and anybody's clothing is askew, because my eye scans that composition before me and I see everything. I see if when the man sat down, if his trousers came up too high and it's too much sock, right? I'll walk over and tug on the cuff of his pants to bring it down so it's not a lot of sock. Or I see everything. My brain can't function otherwise. I see every little detail and I have an ability to scan things. And of course, this becomes really honed after 33 years of photographing people. Right? So I'm embraced. Amongst those that I serve as a photographer, I'm embraced for my neatness, for which I've always been made fun of by my own family because they're not speaking my language, right? I knew instantly I was for the affluent clientele. I'm also, I'm a long-term thinker, which they have the money to think long-term. I'm extremely neat and detailed, which they require because their homes are impeccable and they extend themselves to other people by giving gifts and such. And they want to make, if they give it, they want it to be perfect. So I've got all the values of someone who has a lot of money. even though I didn't come from that. But I understood the values. I even understood the additional responsibilities. Now, again, I spent 3 decades serving this clientele who I will say not one of the stereotypes I ever heard growing up are true. They are, in fact, the most giving, most responsible parents, like really catering to their children. And they can open up, because of their money, they can open up a world of opportunity for their families. Right. And put it to good use. I also found, which surprised me, that people, and this taught me a lot about success, the successful people, I'm talking about CEOs and celebrities and people I photographed. I was surprised at their level of personal development, that they actually are people who have read Think and Grow Rich, and they read all these books and embraced knowledge to grow themselves. So they truly, even if they came from that, blue blood Ivy League background, even if they came from that, I found the overall to still be very interested in development as a person and having a success mindset. It wasn't just given to them. Even if they came from it, those that really, now I will say, because I speak the lingo of my clientele so clearly and so specifically, I also admit I probably have a little bit of a naive view on the world, because I'm only calling forward people that think that way. Right? I'm not calling forward. I have no interest in working with people who want photographs that capture the image but don't have an essence to it. It's not how I photograph. I photograph with a heart and a soul and a deep connection with my clients. So I don't call forward, because I'm not speaking the lingo of shallowness. I'm speaking the lingo of connection and handing down.
Yeah, so you really understand step 1 in this process, and that's know the perspective of your ideal customer. And you did that first day you went into Manhattan and started studying what do luxury buyers really want. And now, over the many years of doing this, you have a great appreciation for their perspective, not yours, but for their, placing
Correct.
them at the center of your story. Number 2 is creating familiarity for your ideal customer. What does that look like?
Yeah. And you actually used the word familiarity a couple of times, and I'm really glad you did, because familiarity actually creates 2 things, right? It creates comfort, right? We are drawn to that which is comfortable for us, right? That's why, Thanksgiving in the United States, same food every year, right? Because there's a comfort to the tradition of Thanksgiving and having the same food every year. So familiarity creates comfort, but it also stands out. And the story I tell in Lingo, I think represents this really well, where I was at a podcast convention, and while I was there, my team let me know that they had just booked a guest that I knew the name of the guest. I knew the name of his book, but I didn't know too much about him. But I knew that I should be excited that it was a good name, big name to have on the show. But I truly didn't know a lot about the work that he did. And flying home from the convention, I go to sit down on the plane, and the guy next to me is reading the book by this guest that was just booked. And I'm not a talker on an airplane. Honestly, most of the time I'm either going to work or I'm going to sleep. It's when I catch up. So I don't typically interact a lot with my seatmate. But hey, I look over, he's reading the book, and I'm thinking there's those weird coincidences, we want to call them, but to me, synchronicity is a sign you're on purpose. Like, these things come along, and I look next to me, and there's this guy, he's reading this book. So I said to him, "How's the book?" He said, "It's pretty good. Actually, I'm just getting into it." And I said, "Well, I have a podcast, and it turns out that, we just booked this guest. So I was kind of curious." Well, that sparked a conversation between he and I. His name is Jason, that we've now had, I guess, about a 4 or 5 year friendship. Actually, just the moment before getting on our conversation today, I was chatting with him on Facebook, I was trying to connect him to somebody else who needs his help. And, here we go. Like, I joke in the book. I said, now, if he had been reading a book, something like the 7 masochistic things to do on a Friday night, I probably wouldn't have spoken up, because that's not my thing. Well, it could be, but it's not my thing. Right. So if it was a book about football, of which I have no interest in, I wouldn't have spoken up. Right. But that was familiar to me, and familiarity stands out. So in businesses, and how it works, in building the lingo of your ideal customer, is if you understand their perspective. These 5 steps are in a strategic order for a reason, because you first have to understand their perspective so that you can know what already feels familiar to them. Like, what do they experience in their level of comfort when they go to restaurants or websites, or, whether it's online, offline. What is it that what gives them an air of familiar? If they're a high-end shopper, for example, I assure you, your website should not look like a dollar store. That's not familiar to them. They're not shopping in dollar stores. So they don't go to websites with a ton of clutter. They go to if it's high end, they go to websites that are clean and very easily to navigate. So that's the power of familiarity. I actually think familiarity is one of the most powerful marketing triggers that's rarely used because not everyone does the deep work to understand the perspective of their ideal customer, to already know this is where they feel at home. They feel at home when their website they interact with, or your place of business, or your promotional materials, when it feels this way. If it feels familiar to them, they're far more likely to feel like you're the fit for them.
Yeah, and they're going to say, you get me. And you said earlier at the top of this show, people don't buy necessarily on price or what's best, but do you get me? I get you and you get me. Exactly. And so it starts with, like you said, the perspective of really understanding it, digging deep enough to then bring that familiarity to them that they can go, oh, Jeffrey Shaw. Oh, look at this. Man, this feels like me. Let's give him a call. Yeah. So then step 3 is present your business in the style of your ideal customer. So what is this? Is this that wrapping of the present without the tape that you learned?
Yeah, to a degree. It's the story you're referring to is that little votive candle that I could buy, which is the only thing in the store for under $20. I had them wrap it because I wanted to know what this clientele expected when they received something, as far as making it look quality. And what I learned as I watched the woman, she was packing it up in just wads and wads of tissue paper, and then she put it into what was clearly a signature box. It was a silver metallic box, and in the box was closed tight with a purple ribbon. So it was, and everything around me was the silver metallic boxes and purple ribbon. So clearly, one indication was, customized packaging is, there's a continuity to it. There's a consistency to it. So you have a signature look, just like Tiffany has that patented blue for their boxes, right? It's a signature. And again, the signature speaks quality. And, but in the moment that the woman was, the gift wrap woman was putting the candle in the tissue paper, she went to go put it in the box, and she stopped really dramatically and looked at me and said, "Don't use any tape." And I inquired why, because I couldn't imagine, why can't you use tape? I jokingly say that in my family, we wrapped our Christmas presents with newspaper and duct tape. How do you not use tape?
When I read that, by the way, it made me immediately think of all of the presents that I've wrapped over the years. I use, of course, cellophane Scotch tape. And when I'm done, man, it's a mess. But, it's like, here's my passion, here's my heart. So yeah, I'm totally with you. I'm the exact.
Yeah, my son's a terrible gift wrapper. So it's just like, folding over the tissue paper and then as much tape as you can possibly put on it to keep it closed, right? That's, that suits the lingo of where I came up, and it's totally fine. But, what I learned was, and I asked why, and she explained to me that this is a gift. Otherwise, I wouldn't have asked it to be gift wrapped. So somebody's going to be giving this as a gift. And before the giver gives it to the recipient, the giver is going to untie the ribbon, take off the box top, unfold the tissue paper to make sure the candle is perfect, then put the tissue paper back, the top back on, and tie the ribbon. You could not do that if there was tape. You would have disturbed the packaging. So more than just understanding the style, which was certainly part of it, what blew me away is that there was a business that knew the actual behavior of their clients so well that it's like they lived it, right? You would only know that if you did the work to understand literally every step that your ideal customer was going to go through. So it was what stood out to me more than anything, Park, was the willingness as a business, because in the 80s we were told not to think that deeply about our customers, right? It was just about making money off of them. But what that taught me was an overwhelming feeling that to really attract and keep my ideal customers, and it's more true today than ever, that we need to care that deeply, right? That we need to, there's a level of deepness that we have to go to. And I think it's even more imperative today that we go deep and have that deep bond and connection before we're ever deserving of anybody's money. So to me, what stood out to me was the willingness for this business to understand their customers so well. And I think we can do that. We need to do that.
How is that reflected in your business? How have you used that to help grow your business?
To this day, as a photographer, we package every one of our portraits the same way. The cool thing I think about meaning we put the portraits in tissue paper goes in a box, tied with a ribbon, there's no tape. The cool thing is, I like to share about my story, is that at 23 years old, I went to Bergdorf Goodman to understand how they operated. And due to what I learned there, I became and still to this day am a Bergdorf Goodman shopper, right? So, my life went from, looking at how this is done to using what I learned to being able to afford to become a customer at the very store which I studied. And when I became a customer, a pretty loyal and ongoing customer at Bergdorf Goodman, which I would do a fair amount of Christmas shopping there, something else I learned in their process was that I would walk around with a shopper and I would say, I'd like one of these, and this is for my Aunt Carol, and I'd like one of these, this is for my mom, and one of these for my friends Roger and Nancy. And so I would point to what I wanted, and the wonderful salesperson was building my cart. And I lived in Connecticut, so at the end of our transaction, everything was going to be shipped to me. Well, when I received a much larger box with all the merchandise, each item individually wrapped, each individual item had the recipient's name on it. So I knew exactly what each gift was going to, so Aunt Carol's box was tagged and my mom's box was tagged, or if there were multiple boxes for my mom, they would be grouped together. And this whole thing is mom. Well, to this day, when I take an order for clients, portrait order, I do the same thing. They'll say, well, I would like 5 8x10s. And I say, well, whom are those 8x10s for? Well, one's for, one for each grandmother, one for my, ex-father-in-law, whatever the list is. My clients, when they receive them, they're individually tagged and they're blown away by that. We also include what we call a care card. So the care card has a quippy little beginning to it that says something like, this card will show you how to take care of your portraits. It starts off by saying something like things I care about, well-being of children, education, abundance for all, like things I care about, like my values. That's what I'm showing first. And then I end up by saying, and care of your portraits. So I explain to them how to take care of their portraits. And then it ends by saying, if you're involved in any charities that support any of the other things that I've said I've cared about, please let me know. We love to donate to charities.
Yes.
Right.
So you are embedding yourself in that style and that luxury, but it's authentic. It's who you are and what you're about. You're not doing it just to make a sale.
Not at all. It's who I am, but it's not an either or, right? And this is where as a coach for creatives, I'm always trying to point out abundance by definition includes financial security, because here's what I know, Park, by the people I work with, the people that I coach and help with their branding, they're what I refer to as the uncommon entrepreneur. People that come to me are doing something out of the box to begin with. They're usually always driven by a deep passion, and they feel their businesses deeply. And because of that, when I can help them reach their next level of financial security, their next level of success, they're just going to become more giving and better at what they do and more purpose driven. Because if you go into business soul centered and purpose driven, no matter what level of success you achieve, you're going to become more of that. I have not yet seen someone go into business that has a beautiful mission and passion and becomes a jerk. Right? If you're a jerk coming in, you're a jerk coming out. But if you go into business driven by passion and purpose, when you achieve financial success, you open up to doing better and bigger things for the world. So I make no apology as a coach or as an entrepreneur in establishing financial success, because I don't think it's an either or. So yes, I did all of these things from my heart, from my soul, what I believed in, and they also led to other beneficial, profitable ventures, whether it's referrals or in many cases, that care card, they would wind up telling me about a charity they're involved with for which I could donate to the silent auction, therefore expanding my business to a whole new market that attends that event that I didn't know about.
Fascinating stuff. We're coming towards the top of the hour. Step 4 is attract your ideal customer with price. And I'm going to ask my listeners, buy Jeffrey's book. It's really phenomenal. Lingo. In it, he's going to teach you about what is the right way to price your service to get what you deserve and what you want out of this. So let's just jump to step 5, Jeffrey. Speak to your ideal customer with the words you choose. Now, of course, this is all about storytelling. What has struck me throughout this entire program is how your story has evolved. First, by understanding you were living into the wrong story for the incorrect people for what you wanted to do to start out. which then you had to change your story, which meant you had to embed yourself in a completely new culture that you were totally unfamiliar with to understand what their journey and what their story and what they expect out of the characters in their story should do, to then create and craft a brand new brand story for yourself, right down to changing a period to a diamond in just the smallest nuance that says, this is who I am and this is what I stand for. And then since then, it sounds like over 3 or 4 decades, you have grown a pretty amazing business and an appreciation for truly understanding your audiences, their lingo, and quite often having to change your own story to be able to connect with theirs. So this comes down to the words you choose. Tell us a little bit about step 5 in this.
Yeah, so it's, and again, as I mentioned earlier, these steps are laid out in a strategy. And yet, if you think about it, most people build their business the complete opposite way. Words are last in the 5-step process of secret language strategy, because you can't know what words to use. You can't apply what I refer to as self-identifying questions, which is posing the questions that are so profoundly and deeply in the mind of your customers that they feel like, holy cow, this business is in my head. This entrepreneur is in my head. You can't do that until you've done the previous 4 steps. And yet, when people go into business, one of the first things they do is they have a logo designed, they build a website, and they fill up that website with a whole bunch of words. And then they come to me and with the big question, like, why am I not getting the right customers? Why are all my customers trying to ask me for discounts and they're not willing to pay me, or I'm not getting any customers? It's like, well, they built their business backwards, which is a classic mistake. Right. So because instead, most people build the business and then try to convince customers to fit in it, as opposed to deeply understand the lingo of your ideal customer and build a business for them. And then you trigger them. I've said numerous times about emotionally triggering people. It's the words that you use. It's those self-identifying questions. It's posing a question that is on the mind of the people who are looking for a solution for which you hold. You hold a solution. Pose the question that gets their attention. So this is, and whether it's a startup, hey, in an ideal world, everyone would, I'd work with people with their brand messaging and lingo and get all these things aligned before they go into business. But the fact of the matter is, the majority of my coaching clients come to me after having been in business, sometimes for 3 years, 5 years, sometimes 20 years, and need to kind of reinvent themselves. Or they've been in business 3 to 5 years and big question, gee, why hasn't it worked? And I look at their business, and probably the most classic situation I see is they're trying to present themselves at high quality premium, but their pricing structure is very cost conscious. And then, I'll say, well, look at your pricing. Your pricing is, $197, $297, $497, $997, like everything's, that whole psychology. And like, well, if you're bringing attention to the fact that $3 is going to fool someone, why are you surprised that people are nickel and diming you? Right. It's a break. And now, if that's who your market is, if you want the cost conscious customer, then by all means draw a great, there's a reason why Walmart prices everything down to the 100th of a cent. There's a reason why your typical department store has all the cash registers lined up in the front of the store like cattle corral. There's a reason for that, because it's bringing attention to the transaction and cost. But if that's not your position in the market, if you don't want to be bickering about cost all the time and you want to be promoting value, then don't bring attention to the cost. Don't be overly specific. Bring attention to the value and the experience that you create.
Interesting. Now let's bring this full circle. You had mentioned at the top of the show that story you were telling about the lady you were trying to sell portraits to, and she said, I can barely feed my kids. I don't have the luxury to be thinking about this. You said there was a point in that story that will bring this full circle.
Gosh, that was so long ago, Park. I'm not sure which, oh, okay. Yeah, I do remember. So, years later, really, because the thing in that is I hadn't at that point taken the time to really understand why I felt so strongly as a photographer. And, a couple of years go by and I realized that to date, and this is true even today, I have one photograph of my childhood. I'm the youngest of 3 boys. And, I know, being the third child, I had huge financial consequences on my family, because when I came along, there was 4 years between myself and my next older brother. When I came along, my mom had to go back to work. It also meant moving out of an apartment in my grandmother's home, and my parents bought their first home, and the first and only home that my mom still lives in. So I, as the third child, brought along financial consequences. And I know suddenly everything was financially a struggle for them. And I was the third, and I was yet another boy. So clearly they were bored and broke and took no photographs of me. Now, my family, we never went to a professional photographer ever, but even snapshots, they're just I have one of my entire childhood. And I one day joked that I think as a photographer, I'm out there fighting on behalf of all the other third children of the world to make sure that they don't get overlooked. But I realized there was actually truth to that. So I told this story. I put the one photograph on that's what my about page on my photography website looks like. It's my baby picture, my one and only. And I share this story that this is, as a photographer, I know how important it is. And I know how it feels as a child, right? And I can speak the lingo of both parent and child, right? I'm a parent talking to parents, but expressing like, hey, this is what it feels like as a child. And that is the most read page on my website. I cannot tell you how many of my clients told me they hired me specifically because of that story, because they related. Either they were also the youngest child, right? Or they were one of 7. I remember one of my clients saying, so people hire me because they know I get them, which is exactly what I'm saying.
Well, Jeffrey, I mean, I'm one of 7, and my dad was an ardent photographer. He just loved to shoot. He was, actually a civil engineer, but he just took pictures of everything. And if you pull out our Kodak carousel slides of each kid, starting with our oldest Dan down to the youngest Mike, and I'm number 5 in that, it looks like a chart. It could be a PowerPoint graphic, because like Dan's carousel is totally full. Yeah. Melody's is 90% full. Tom's is 80% full. And you get down to poor Mike, and he's got like 14 slides.
You got it. Exactly. So it's it could be interest lost. It could be time. It could be money. But again, this is a level of responsibility that those with money can't. When you have money, money is not an excuse. None of my clients could ever turn to their kids. I mean, let's put it this way. No family of affluence is going to send 2 of the kids to Ivy League and the third to community college. They can't. There's a level of responsibility for equity that comes inherent when you have money, that all your children, and that's, knowing that, like I always say, as a photographer, I'm speaking the lingo of responsibility. I help my clients be the most responsible parents they can be by making sure they're buttoned down, every detail, and every child is photographed equally and as often and at the same ages.
That's fantastic. Jeffrey, thank you so much for being here, folks. His book, it's so worth buying. Lingo, Discover Your Ideal Customer Secret Language and Make Your Business Irresistible. Jeffrey, where can people go to learn more about you? So, in the interest of walking my talk, I like to try to make a connection first. So my recommendation is to go to jeffreyshaw.com/BUS story, one word, BUS story, kind of an abbreviation of your show name. We've created a page just for your show where people can go and grab what I call the LINGO Media Kit, which is an infographic of the 5 steps with a little brief explanation. So you have a visual understanding of the 5 important steps to speak the lingo of your customers. Has a free chapter in it, which is not the first chapter. That would be too easy. It's the 3rd chapter, which is the chapter on perspective, because I think that's the most important thing to start with. And then there's also the audio version of that chapter. So go grab the LINGO Media Kit at jeffreyshaw.com/BUS story and start there, because if you start there, if you like what I'm all about, if you feel like I get you and you get me, you're going to find me. All my contacts are, the links to the book are there. Everything's there. So if you start there, you'll find your way everywhere else that we can connect. jeffreyshaw.com/BUS story. That's great, man. I appreciate you doing that for us and for our listeners. And thanks so much for being here. It's just been an absolute pleasure. I love the book, and I really enjoyed this conversation.
Likewise, Park. Thank you very much for having me.
All right. And thank you all for listening to this edition of Business of Story. If you like what you heard, share the show. Share it with friends, with family, with business associates, with people who are really trying to do their best, but maybe they just confided in you last week that, gosh, it's not working for me, or I'm working my butt off, but I don't seem to be getting where I want to go. This book will help them. This show will help them. So please refer them over to listen to the Business of Story in this episode with Jeffrey. And of course, if there's anything I can do to help you craft and tell compelling stories that sell, please visit me at businessofstory.com. And while you're at it, if you like what you're hearing, jump over to iTunes and give us a rating and let the rest of the world know. But I appreciate you being here, and I hope you'll come back next week and we'll have another story artist like Jeffrey on the show. And until then, remember, the most potent story you'll ever tell is the story you tell yourself. So make it a great one. Thanks for listening.